Ready? Cool. Yeah, thank you for having us. So, this presentation is basically to give all of you a sense of the historic rehabilitation tax credit program. How it works, how you can take advantage of it. What the rules and the guidelines are. So, my name is Sam DeSillis. I'm a tax credit program navigator at the State Historic Preservation Office. But what that means basically is that my role is to assist new applicants, to kind of walk them through the application process, to assist people with any process-related questions they might have, just to overall, help them navigate that application process. So can we go next slide? Okay, so just to start off, what is a tax credit? For the purposes of this program, it's a credit, from either the state or the federal government that will reduce the tax liability that you owe the next time you are filing your taxes. And again, it's different from a deduction, but a key thing to note here as well is that the State Historic Preservation Office, which Nathan and I are both a part of, our focus is very much on the buildings themselves, on their historic eligibility, on the work being done to them. Our focus is not so much on the financial aspects of it. So if you're interested in applying for these tax credits and you have like concrete questions about how those tax credits will be applied or if they'll fit your financial situation, I would suggest talking to the Ohio Department of Development or to the IRS. And so another important thing to note is that there are actually two sets of tax credits that are available to people in Ohio. There is one at the federal level and one at the state level. And these have slightly different program parameters and eligibility requirements, which I'll get into in a bit. We would do a next slide. So to start off with, what qualifies a property as historic? So there are three ways that a property can qualify for the purposes of this program. And this is applying to both the federal and the state program. So the first way is to be individually listed on the National Register of Historic Places as a single property. Second way is to be part of a National Register Historic District. And I want to focus on the district listing in particular because it's important to note that not every property in one of these National Register districts is considered a contributing property. And this varies on a case-by-case basis, but for example, if a property was built, significantly after the other properties around it, then it might not be considered contributing because it's not from the same period of time as everything else. And then the third way that you can qualify for these credits is if you are locally designated by a certified local government. Now, not every municipality, is a certified local government, so this is not available to everyone in Ohio. But, if you are one, and I believe Bowling Green is, then you have that option available to you as well. So I should note, as far as the National Register nominations go, if you are trying to get your property on the National Register, because this is a more complicated process typically than getting it onto, a CLG listing, it's a multi-step process you have to go through. Now, to start off with, we recommend that applicants will fill out a preliminary questionnaire, which basically goes over their property's historic status and kind of helps identify from the start if the property is likely to qualify for that National Register nomination. Following this preliminary questionnaire, you can fill out and submit an official nomination form to the Ohio SHPO, at which point one of our reviewers will take a look at it and it will be evaluated. And if it is approved, then the reviewer will move that on to the next body, which would be, sorry, can we go to the next slide? So the Ohio Historic Site Preservation Advisory Board, or OSPAB, which is a board of professionals and public members that reviews National Register nominations within Ohio. And so they meet, I believe, 4 times a year. Last year, they held one meeting in March, one meeting in June, one in September, and one in December, just to give you a sense of their typical timeline. And at each one of these meetings, a reviewer will basically, they'll show up and they will present briefly on each of the properties that are, available for listing on the register. And then OSPAB will decide whether or not they want to approve that nomination. Once OSPAB has approved the nomination, then it will go to the National Park Service for final review. Once the National Park Service has taken a look at that nomination, and once that has been approved, the property will finally get added to the National Register of Historic Places. And so, this process can take a while. For some projects, it can take upwards of a year. And so it's important to keep that in mind just because if your tax credits are going to be contingent on that National Register status, it's good to be kind of aware in advance of, the amount of time it can take to kind of work through that process. And you can see on the official Ohio History Connection website here, there is a web page which basically goes into the National Register application. And you can see here it goes through the different parts of the application. It has the forms you need to download. And so if that is a path you're interested in pursuing for your property, you can feel free to reach out to us. Next slide. Oh, yeah, of course. Sorry, I should have mentioned that at the start. If anyone has any questions during the presentation, feel free to just raise your hand. And yeah, I will answer it.
Sam, summary, we are certified.
Yes.
That's good.
So it depends on what tax credits you're applying for. And I can get into this in the, I believe it's the next slide. Oh, that's adjusted basis. Okay, so, all right, I'll return to that CLG National Register thing in a moment. But yeah, so this is another eligibility requirement that is in place for properties. And this is only if you're going to be applying for the federal tax credits. And so this is something called adjusted basis. And adjusted basis is basically a metric that determines the minimum amount of money that you have to spend on your rehabilitation of the property for it to qualify. And you calculate your adjusted basis through that equation up there. So you take the purchase price of the property at the time that you bought the property, you subtract the cost of the land or the value of the land, again, at the time that you bought the property, you subtract any subsequent depreciation, and then finally, you add the cost of any capital improvements that you've made to the property. So, if you've bought a historic property and then you made a bunch of renovations to it following that purchase, that would count towards the adjusted basis of the property. And then the number that you're left with at the end is the adjusted basis. And if you're applying for federal historic tax credits, your total rehabilitation expenses must exceed that number. So this is not an issue for most applications, but in some cases where properties were, particularly, expensive to acquire, or maybe the rehabilitation is limited to like certain parts of the property, that there can be instances where the adjusted basis does come into play. And so that's something to be aware of if you're going to be applying for those federal tax credits. And then some other qualifying criteria for the tax credits. So for both the federal and the state program, your property must be income producing to qualify. So you cannot qualify for these tax credits with a owner-occupied residence, and the property must have some kind of commercial end use. In addition, while the building owner does not have to be the person applying for these credits, they must be aware of the application and they must basically state their acknowledgement and approval of the tax credits being pursued in writing. So we go to the next slide. Okay, so this is where we kind of break down the difference between the federal and the state historic tax credits. And so this goes back to that earlier question about CLGs versus National Register. So for the federal historic tax credits, you must have a National Register listing to qualify. A CLG listing does not qualify you for the federal historic tax credits. However, a CLG listing does qualify you for the state historic tax credits. If you have a National Register listing, you can qualify for both sets of tax credits, but a CLG listing will only qualify you for the state credits. So again, that's something that's important to be aware of. And in addition, to many of the other differences between these programs. So I'm going to start off by going through the federal program because in some ways it's a little more straightforward. So the federal program offers a 20% tax credit against your qualified rehabilitation expenses. And this is a flat amount. It's a non-competitive process. So if you apply for those federal credits, and if the work that you're proposing meets the standards, you're guaranteed to receive those tax credits. However, as I've mentioned, you must have that National Register listing to qualify. And as we talked about earlier, a National Register listing can be a little time-consuming to acquire. Fortunately, the federal program does give you a little flexibility on this, because they allow you to apply with a preliminary determination of eligibility. And basically what that means is, if you're applying for these federal credits and your property has a National Register nomination that is currently underway, that has not yet been finalized, you can attach a draft nomination for that National Register listing to your tax credit application, and that will qualify you for the federal credits. So the National Register listing does not have to be finalized at the time that you apply for the federal credits. And so that does help applicants out a little as far as kind of coordinating the timing on that. Yes. So there does need to be a draft nomination that would, meet with SHPO approval. It's more just, is it kind of working its way through the process as far as like OSPAB and NPS go? Yeah, and for the federal program, there's the adjusted basis requirement, which is not a requirement for the state program. Let's see, the income producing requirement. So for the federal program, there is not a pre-app meeting is not required, but we do encourage applicants to talk with us before they submit application materials, just to make sure that, we're aware of any potential issues with the project. And beyond that, the federal program has a 5-year look back period after your project has received its final certification. And that's important to be aware of because, for 5 years after you have completed the construction on your property, after you've received that final tax credit certification, any subsequent work you do on that property, you will have to reach out to SHPO within that 5-year window to basically see if that work would meet the standards and if it would, meet with SHPO approval. And you may have to submit a post Part 3 amendment, to kind of get that in our system and to get it kind of verified. And so that is something to be aware of if you're applying for the federal credits. And in addition to that, the federal tax credit is non-refundable, meaning that you can only use it to lessen your tax liability. Now, for the state historic tax credit, this one is a little more complicated. So the state tax credit offers 25% tax credit against qualified rehabilitation expenditures. However, for cities that are less than 300,000 people, that credit rises to 35%. So for people in Bowling Green, we'd have access to a potential of 35% tax credit from the state. However, I should note that the state tax credit application process is a little more complicated. Unlike the federal program, which has a rolling deadline, the state program is run in 2 rounds per year, one in the spring and one in the fall. If you're going to be applying for the state tax credits, you must meet the deadlines within that round to qualify. In addition to that, the state tax credit process is competitive. So, in addition to the building application you're submitting to SHPO, you will also be submitting a competitive application to the Ohio Department of Development. And that application will basically go over a series of scoring criteria for your property. And then ODOD will score your property on a 100-point scale. And of all the projects that apply in a given round, the projects that have scored the highest are the ones that will receive the tax credits. And so this is all just to say that for the state tax credits, there is that element of uncertainty involved in that, your work might meet the standards, but your property might still not get awarded just due to the scoring criteria. And so that's something to be aware of. If you have further questions about the scoring process, I would suggest reaching out to Lisa Brownell at ODOD. Yeah, you have a question?
Rose Asian
Mhm.
because Wood County never had. So they were there that allows them to have more points. Because reporting right. Other.
Yeah, that's fantastic to hear. Here at SHPO, we're not really involved in the scoring process, so I don't want to get too into the weeds on the criteria there, but that's fantastic. Did you have a question? Um, I am not sure on that, Nathan.
Is a little bit above. It's what is
Thank you. Yes. You have a question?
Yeah.
Of the total ones that apply to like ODOD? Do we have those numbers?
it, for it,
And with the talk about the categories here. Yeah, so yeah, I can talk about that. So basically, because ODOD does understand that, sometimes you have some projects applying that are asking for like $5-10 million, that are clearly, they are going to be taking a large chunk of that money if they are awarded. And so they basically set up these size brackets for projects so that projects of wildly disparate sizes aren't going to be competing against each other for the same money. And the way those brackets are allocated, I believe from the ODOD materials, is like in the small category, the qualified rehabilitation expenditures of your property would be under, I believe, 1.25 million. And then the intermediate category, the qualified rehabilitation expenditures would be, I believe, between about like 1 and 10 million. And then I believe above that, everything else is just in the large category. But again, I would suggest talking to Lisa Brownell at ODOD if you want kind of more in-depth discussion of the scoring and kind of how that would impact you, because it really does vary, very much year by year based on kind of how many applicants apply, kind of how crowded these categories can get, and just kind of how the how the scoring shakes out really. So any other questions? Yes. Yeah, that was this bill 225 from the Ohio legislature. I think that was just passed last year, or was like implemented last year. And so yeah, that did increase the the percentage for those properties in cities of less than 300,000. In addition to that, I believe it also raised the overall cap on like the maximum project size from like $5 to $10 million, along with doubling the state program's overall like annual funding. So I mean, it injected quite a bit of fresh money into the program, and we are definitely looking to kind of take advantage of that and ensure that people are able to get their properties rehabilitated and able to take advantage of this program. Sorry, could you go back to that last one? I want to see if there was anything else I'd meant to mention. So in terms of the state program, oh yeah, so you can qualify for the state program with either a national register or a CLG listing. So that's something to be aware of. However, the state program does not allow for preliminary determinations. So what that means is that, you can't attach a draft nomination to your state form. You must have a qualifying historic designation at the start of the process. And so what you see some applicants do, because I should mention, the majority of applicants in Ohio apply for both the federal and the state tax credits. Just because these credits can be applied for concurrently and they can be stacked. So, many people find that to be the most kind of efficient way of doing things. And so what many applicants will do is, if they have a national register listing that's kind of still in the pipeline, they will get a CLG listing for their property because those typically have like a shorter turnaround time. And then they will apply for the state and the federal credits. They'll use the draft nomination for the national register to qualify them for the federal credits. And then they'll use the CLG listing to qualify them for the state credits. And obviously this isn't a requirement or anything like that. Well, for the state program, it is a requirement that you have a historic designation, but you don't have to do it exactly like that. But that's one way that applicants will kind of, handle that divide. So beyond that, for the state program, you must hold a pre-application meeting with the SHPO offices. And so that will be with a tax credit reviewer who will basically just go over your project plan with you. And the state program, there's no look back period, and the tax credit is also refundable, meaning that if the credit you receive will, if it exceeds your tax liability in that given year, then the state will cut you a check for the difference. So, a lot of applicants, like that aspect of the state tax credit program. We move on to the next slide. Yes. Yeah. So if the building's going to be turned into rental properties, like for tenants, that should be fine. A lot of properties are turned into like apartment spaces, stuff like that. It's more, I think, when it's it's a condo that like is actually going to be sold to the tenants outright, is my impression. Yeah, I think that's the difference between them in that regard.
Basically, what and technically, I don't know. And on 20.
Oh yeah, totally. Yes. So
That's okay. That's perfect. Feeling, that's- I'm gonna double check. That- Sometimes for that,
yeah, the IRS, being the one that administers the federal tax credit program, they have like a pretty helpful FAQ about the program on their website, which will go into instances like that where there is the owner lives in the residence, but there's also a large portion of it that's given over to a commercial use. And so yeah, I would suggest talking to a tax professional to kind of get a more informed perspective on that, because again, here at SHPO, our focus is not on the taxes or the financial side of things, but on the buildings and on making sure that they are, rehabilitated according to the standards. Okay, does anyone else have any other questions? Okay, so the pre-application meeting, again, it's a requirement if you're going to be applying for those state credits. Basically, it's just a meeting to talk with the reviewer before you formally submitted any application materials. And the idea is just to give them a sense of your project scope, sense of what's being planned, a sense of the property overall, so that they can, offer helpful feedback or catch any potential issues that might cause the project problems later on down the line. And again, this is not a requirement for the federal program, because most applicants will apply for the state and the federal credits concurrently. The pre-app meeting will wind up applying to the federal credits as well, but you can decide how you want to do that. So we do next slide. Oh, and I should also note the building owner is required to participate in those meetings. So next slide as well. So then, now as far as the actual application, so once you've completed the pre-application meeting, you would then basically have a 3-part application that you have to submit to SHPO. And if you're applying for the federal and the state credits concurrently, you can use the same forms for both of these. So it's not like there's a separate form for the state optic versus the federal program. That being said, as I did mention earlier, there is that competitive application with ODOD, which talks about the scoring. That's completely different from this, but that is something to be aware of if you're applying for the state credits. So for the actual tax credit application to SHPO, Part 1 is basically what will go over your building's historic eligibility and its current condition. And this is basically, how you will demonstrate that your building qualifies for this program. And so this is where those historic designations from earlier come back in. So if your property is individually listed as a single building on the National Register of Historic Places, you do not actually have to submit a Part 1 to the SHPO offices. And again, that's only if the building is individually listed as a single building. If it is individually listed as like maybe a building complex or something like that, or like a farm or something, then that would not count. But it has to be individually listed as a standalone building. Now, if your property is listed on the National Register as part of a district, then you do have to submit a Part 1 form, which will basically just go over your property's historic, role, its presence in the district, all of that. For buildings not yet listed on the National Register, you have to include that draft National Register nomination that I mentioned earlier. And then a CLG designation can also qualify you for your Part 1 for the state tax credit program only. So can we move on to the next slide? All right, now this is a screenshot of the actual Part 1 application form. So basically Part 1 goes over your building's condition and its current eligibility. And so, the condition of the property is especially important to document because in some cases, properties have deteriorated so far that there's just no longer enough historic fabric left to qualify. And so, for the Part 1 of your application, we ask that, you demonstrate there is enough of that historic material remaining. And so that means we're providing comprehensive photographs of the property. And so for these photographs, we ask that it really go over the property, all of it essentially, the interiors, all the exteriors, enough to give just a truly, just 360 comprehensive view of the property. And I should also note the Part 1 application must be submitted hard copy. This goes for all parts of the SHPO application forms. And this is that's our system for the time being. I know there is talk of kind of digitization further on down the line, but for the moment and for the immediate future, all tax credit applications have to be submitted to us as paper applications. And we also ask that if you're submitting it, you submit 2 copies of each, so that we can have one for our records and then one for NPS. We move on to the next slide. Cool. So for the photos themselves, there's kind of specific guidelines that SHPO asks that applicants follow when documenting their property. So for one, the photos must have labels on the back that contain a good amount of information about them. And so each photo needs to be numbered. It needs to have the date the photo was taken. It needs to have the address that it was taken. It needs to have a brief description of what is shown in the photo. And then it needs to specify whether that photo is pre or post rehabilitation. And then lastly, we ask that you take a floor plan of the property, and then you take the number of each photo and you attach it to that floor plan. And then have an arrow pointing in the direction the photo was taken, so that basically the reviewer can, look at each individual photo and then, concretely tie that to a portion of the building. So that way they can form like a clear image of the interior layout of the property. And this is, very important because in many cases, the SHPO reviewer will not be able to physically visit the property. And, for the NPS reviewers, the federal reviewers, they obviously cannot visit our properties because they're located in Washington, D.C. So having like comprehensive photo documentation of the property is very important to ensuring that, the reviewers get a good sense of the property's current condition. Second, there are elevation drawings. These are not required for all applications, but if you're going to be doing exterior changes to the property, you do have to submit an elevation drawing showing architectural details and measurements like this one. It's possible as well, if you're going to be making like additions to the rooftop, the facade of the property, that you may have to provide renderings of the property to basically show if it would be like visible to passersby on the street. But again, this is a case-by-case basis. This is not the case for all projects, just projects that are planning on making changes to the building exterior. So then, once you've submitted Part 1, and that's been approved, then got Part 2. And this is really the meat and potatoes of the application. This is the part that is typically the most involved for applicants, because this is where you're actually going to be discussing the proposed work on the property. And so in Part 2, there's a specific format that we ask applicants follow. Basically, you break up your property into what we call work items. And one work item could be, brickwork or the windows or HVAC and plumbing. Basically, by dividing up the property into these discrete components, then for each component, you will describe first, the condition of that work item, and then you'll describe the work that's being done to it. And basically, the reviewers will take a look at that Part 2 that has been submitted. And I should note as well, it is really important to be very detailed in these descriptions and in the narrative, because the reviewers, they do need to form a clear image of the property based on those descriptions as well. And so upon receipt of your Part 2 application, the reviewer will take a look at it. If, all of those work items, if the work being proposed meets the standards, then the reviewer will approve it and they will send it on to NPS. If they have questions or if they need further information about the project, they may reach out to the applicant with something that's called a hold letter. And a hold letter, it puts the application on hold temporarily while they wait for the applicant to provide that additional information that they need to make an informed assessment of the project. And so, it's important for applicants to respond to holds, in a prompt fashion if they want the project to proceed, promptly. Sorry, did you have a question? Yeah. No, go for it. So there are consultants that will kind of handle more of the the nitty-gritty of the paperwork on behalf of applicants. SHPO cannot recommend anybody specifically, just due to conflict of interest. That being said, we do keep lists of like qualified consultants and historic preservation professionals that you could potentially consult if you're interested in just kind of like some names of people that are working in this field. But yeah, it is very common, I would say, for applicants to bring on board a consultant or somebody like that to kind of help them shepherd that project through the application process. And I mean that, yeah. No, yeah, it can be complicated. And, that's not to say that like it's impossible for somebody to handle this on their own. We have had applicants that have, applied, they were the building owner, they didn't have any consultants or outside help, and they did get through the process successfully. But yeah, we totally understand if applicants do want to bring in some outside assistance there. So, and I should also note for part 2, so these work items, they're going to be evaluated based on their conformance with the Secretary's standards of rehabilitation. And you can see them on screen here. These are the only review metric that reviewers, either at the state or the federal level, are permitted to use when evaluating these projects. And so I'm not going to go through all 10 of these points, but kind of in a nutshell, the standards are very focused on material and visual impact. So material impact, that's the actual historic fabric of the property, the physical material that kind of, ties it to its past. And SHPO is very focused on ensuring that that historic fabric is preserved and repaired rather than replaced. We are very focused on ensuring that anything in the property that can be repaired is, and that, we're not just kind of replacing things to make it, look nicer. In addition to that, as far as the visual impact goes, that's referring to the building's aesthetic qualities, the things that made it kind of visually distinctive, that made it, an important part of the, the community. And similarly, when rehabilitating a property, we ask that, applicants, respect that visual integrity of the building and try to ensure that any changes or rehabilitation they're doing is not going to compromise that. And yeah, your reviewer can talk about this with you a little more in depth. As far as the actual application of the standards go, so for the state tax credit program, your SHPO reviewer will have the final word on the construction work. So they'll have the final say over whether or not that work meets the standards. For the federal program, what happens is that the state reviewer will take a look at the project. They will, conduct a review, they will issue a recommendation, and then they will forward that project to the National Park Service. And then a National Park Service reviewer will take a look at it, and then they will make the final determination, at which point the applicant will be notified. That being said, we do try to coordinate closely with NPS to ensure that our decisions are the same and to ensure that, there aren't any like conflicts there. Next slide. So in addition to that, SHPO has a list of basic submission requirements for applicants that are basically designed to give you a sense of the language and the level of detail that we are asking for in these Part 2 applications. And again, I'm not going to go through every one of these points because, as you can see, they're a little wordy, but kind of, touching on a few of them. When it comes to like HVAC and plumbing systems or something like that, if you're going to be running systems through the walls of the property, in your application, you must describe both the dimensions of the actual space within the walls and then the dimensions of the largest system feature that you're going to be putting through it. We move on to the next slide. Okay, so then you can also see when it comes to like rooftop work, if you're going to be doing anything on the rooftop, you have to detail if that's going to be visible to passersby, and you might have to have renderings or drawings of it kind of indicate that. Next one. Sorry, can we go back one? So I did want to pause and focus on windows for a moment, because windows can be a particularly tricky part of a tax credit application just because, they involve multiple parts and they're often very essential to a building's visual integrity, like the actual appearance of a building just affected so much by the windows and, the condition that they're in. And so when it comes to any kind of rehabilitation work involving windows, we ask that if you plan on replacing any windows, that you document the window's condition via photographs, detailed narrative, and then basically run it by us first. Just because, again, our focus really is on preserving and retaining that historic fabric, and we want to ensure that, no historic windows are like needlessly replaced or anything like that. So windows I would highlight as an area of the tax credit application that can be particularly tricky. You have a question? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. With
I cannot speak to the rules on whether like thermal panes and stuff would be required in Windows.
We'll look at it. Good. Okay, great. Now,
That's not it.
Right. Wait. Great.
Definitely. Yeah, Windows can certainly pose issues for tax credit projects. So definitely encourage you to if you have questions about window work or anything like that, to get in touch with your reviewer. So just go through a couple more. So for masonry work, another thing to note here, like if you're going to be replacing brickwork or repointing mortar, you have to specify in your narrative what percentage of brickwork or mortar is going to be replaced. And I mean, it doesn't have to be like, down to the decimal point or anything like that, but it should be enough to give like a clear sense of what overall percentage of the masonry on the property needs to be replaced. So I wanted to also show just a brief example work item from a Part 2 application, just to give a sense of the kind of formatting and language that SHPO is looking for. So this is taken from an actual tax credit application from a last round, I believe. And so this is what was originally submitted to us. So you can see here, there are some useful details there as far as the construction of the exterior walls. But ultimately, in their description of the work to the feature, that kind of language would not be sufficient by SHPO standards. And specifically, you can see here, they're basically saying, intent is to repair the mortar points per the preservation brief. So rather than citing the preservation brief, we would ask that they actually explain in detail what it is they're going to be doing. Similarly, when they say something like, the rear facade will all loose or removed by the gentlest means possible. So we urge applicants to steer clear of language like gentlest means possible, because it's very vague and subjective. One person's definition of that might be very different than another's. So we ask that the applicants have much more clear and direct descriptions of the work that's being done. And you can see here from the, this is the revised version, and the red text is basically what the applicant added after the reviewer had talked to them. So you can see here, I'm sorry, can we go back? So see here, it specifies, the amount of work being done, that they're not going to be causing any damage to the property. Specifies that they're going to be using hand tools to clear off some of this. It specifies they're going to be using like a hose, rinsed at garden hose pressure with the nozzle pointed down. And you don't need to follow these exactly, but the idea is just that you really need to be spelling out in detail all the steps that will be taken on the property. Yes, question? So actually, we can get into that shortly. That's a cool view. So yeah, this is starting rehabilitation work after your Part 2 has been approved is when you can feel comfortable actually starting the work. And we strongly encourage applicants to hold off on starting rehabilitation work until they've gotten that Part 2 approval, just because any work done before receiving SHPO approval is done at the owner's own risk, and it may result in the need for remediation in order to receive those tax credits. So if the property is like really falling apart, there may be opportunities for emergency stabilization work, like if there's a hole in the roof or something like that. But please consult SHPO first. So can we go on to the next one? So yeah, and amendments. This is getting into your question earlier about kind of if the work itself is being monitored during the process. So I would say it's not like we send reviewers around just to kind of randomly check properties to see if the work is following the standards, but it is ultimately applicants' responsibility to ensure that when they submit their Part 3 application, that the work that's been done matches the work that was described and approved in Part 2. And so that being said, during the construction process, we do understand that sometimes things can, unexpected things can occur. You might have to revise your plans or adjust them. And if something like that arises, we urge you to reach out to your reviewer to discuss what those proposed changes would be. And, if those changes are substantial enough, they may urge you to submit a project amendment, which, as the name suggests, is basically amending your Part 2 to basically state whatever this changed work is going to be. So there's not an upper limit on the number of amendments you can submit, but you can submit multiple items under a single amendment so long as the work hasn't started yet. And again, it's very important to submit these amendments because when you get to Part 3 of the application, they're going to be checking if the work that was completed matches the work that was approved. And if it doesn't, then you may not receive the tax credits. And so the amendments are a way to kind of keep your reviewer in the loop and a way to ensure that you're not like boxed into that Part 2 application completely. Okay, cool. On to Part 3 now. So this is the last part of the application. This is submitted after the project work is done. It's pretty straightforward. Basically, you just photograph the property the same way you did in Part 1, just to document that all of the work was completed as described and approved in Part 2. So you will receive final certification once that Part 3 has been approved. And remember, the federal program has that 5-year look-back, a recapture period. The state program does not. So, that's something to be aware of as well as your project is kind of coming to a close. And I guess just in summary, it can seem like a fairly complicated application process, but, ultimately, if you follow these steps, you should receive the credits. If you just work with us on your submission, receive approval, you amend if those revisions are needed, get approval on those revisions. And then if you only complete the work for which you received approval and, which meets the Secretary's standards, then you'll receive final certification and you'll receive those tax credits. Can we do our next slide? So finally, I just wanted to touch briefly on if you have a project with multiple structures, this varies on a case-by-case basis, but in some cases, you can group together multiple buildings under a single project if those structures were functionally related historically. And again, this varies quite a bit on a case-by-case basis based on, the property's historic relationship with each other. But some of those relationships could be if they were kind of constructed for a common purpose, they shared kind of a common entrance, if they shared these common features, anything like that. So if you have multiple properties that you think may qualify under this metric, again, I would encourage you to reach out to SHPO because the definition of a functional relationship can vary quite a bit based on the building's unique histories. And then finally, I just wanted to touch on qualified rehabilitation expenditures. So these are the building expenses that are covered by the tax credit. And the basic rule of thumb that we use for QREs is that if you turn the building over, whatever doesn't fall out is a QRE. So, like furniture and appliances, those would not be considered QREs. But, structural elements and building systems, those would be QREs. In addition, soft costs, such as architects and consultants, do count as QREs. Do you have a question? Oh, sorry. But yeah, in addition, additions outside the building envelope, like landscaping work, sidewalks, fencing, and stuff are generally not permitted under the program. So, go to the next slide. And then this is just a brief list of some examples of things that are and are not considered QREs. This is not a comprehensive list. Again, this is something of an IRS question, like what things specifically fall under that umbrella. But this should just give you an overall idea. And then just some final tips for applicants. If you're interested in applying for these tax credits, we encourage you to reach out to SHPO as soon as possible. This is a process that you can and should start early. It gives you a chance to talk to SHPO before you have kind of become wedded to those rehabilitation plans. And in addition, with the state tax credits, the reviewer schedules can get much busier around those deadlines. And so it can kind of help to avoid some of that crunch time. So, and yeah, just in terms of additional resources, I would urge you to look at the Ohio Department of Development webpage about this program. They have a lot of very useful information. They also have contact information for Lisa. The NPS page, National Park Service, they have a lot of very great resources. I'm talking about historic preservation. Also, the IRS, which oversees, the administration of these credits. And yeah, also the OHC website, which is, again, the organization that Nathan and I work for. And yeah, so if you are interested in applying for those credits, then that's where you would go. So yeah, if anyone has any additional questions, I'm happy to answer them. If not, Nathan also has a presentation, and I'm sure he would be happy to give that. Lots of pictures, yeah. So, my role is kind of to talk a little more about the process. His role as a reviewer is to talk more about the actual work involved in the project.
At least it's not too bad on construction noise. I'm used to it though. There's a construction site across from my apartment, and I'm used to having those pre-app meetings and stuff, and I have to fight with yelling over the jackhammer next door. So I'm Nathan Bevel. I've been here bunches of times. I'm the Certified Local Government and Preservation Services Manager. So I oversee the CLG program. So if you have questions on that, I can answer those questions. And that's the reason I've been here multiple times before. But this is a little bit different. I also do some tax credit review. So we're just taking a look at that. Could I use the clicker myself, or does it proximity have to be there? Oh, is it? Just that way, because I feel we are being like, so the standards of rehabilitation are the same thing that you use if you're dealing with your local historic preservation commission. It's 10 standards. Sam gave you the long verbose version. Basically, though, it boils down to 3 primary principles: that you are protecting historic character, protecting historic materials, and that you're emphasizing the replacement of those materials, or retention of those materials, repair of those materials over replacement. Because thinking about it, when you start removing a lot of historic materials, you're removing that historic fabric, and therefore you start having something that looks historic as opposed to actually being historic. And then it also, when you do have to make a change, it is something that is going to be compatible with the historic building. It does apply to all parts and types of buildings, and it does apply both interior and exterior. So if you're used to design review, typically you're looking at this and you're thinking of it, well, I'm just having the exterior looked at. Tax credits are a whole different ballgame. This is looking at the interior and the site work also. So, if you're used to going to local design review, it's going to be one set of things. This is looking at the interior and exterior. So going over the standards, standard 1. All right, I'm going to go get my talk just so I can keep a better view of it. Standard 1 defines the compatible use. What we're looking at is there's a use of the building that does not require significant change, significant alteration to the historic building. So if you have to build a gigantic addition to your building to make it fit into the proposed use, it may not be a good match for that historic building. In this case, we have a historic school that was turned into senior housing. It had very wide corridors, so people with mobility issues, have scooters, or have wheelchairs were able to navigate. People were able to use the wider doors as classroom doors, so it fit that purpose really well. Quite frankly, this is something we've seen on a regular basis. This school, which is in Washington Courthouse, actually also had a really extra bonus. They had a gymnasium that was still attached, and they actually are reusing it as a community center. So all around, the building was being reused. It found a sympathetic use that was able to fit into that building. Standard 2 is about retaining historic character. When you walk into a space, how does it feel historic? Can you feel what that historic building would have looked like, or how it would have felt in that historic case? In some cases, on your right, with the doors, with the trim, that we'll be looking at, it's going to have finished walls. It's going to have trim around the doors. It's going to be a finished space. So if we were to go into that building and you were proposing to rip all the plaster off and just have exposed brick walls, that's not going to be part of the historic character of that building, and we would say that does not meet the standard. On the reverse of that, the building beside it is an old warehouse. It's actually an old power station. We would expect that building to look industrial at the end. It was an industrial building, it should look industrial. And so having exposed brick, provided you probably encapsulated the lead in that case, is going to be a good thing. It's going to represent that historic character of the building. We're going to want to see open spaces. We're going to see a lot of that character-defining big open manufacturing space. Standard 3 is to avoid a false sense of development. Or, as I always like to call it, we're not making it phony colony. This also, though, means not using salvaged materials. This is generally against preservation. We dissuade it because, one, it encourages the deconstruction of historic buildings to get salvaged materials. And two, one of the issues is when people would reuse historic materials that are inappropriate for the time frame or the style of the building. So we would have someone who wants to have a very ornate Victorian mantle in an Italianate house. It may not fit the right style. And so generally speaking, we would not recommend using those materials. If you sell us using salvage, we're going to say take that out of your application. Because the building, again, must reflect that period of significance. Sam mentioned it when he talked about National Register, but there's a time frame when you have a National Register district or a National Register nomination that it looks at. This is when this was listed. This is when the changes happened. This is when it's significant. Sorry, I've got a frog on my throat today. And so it's looking at that time frame when the changes were made, and then alterations are going to be respecting that specific time frame. This also, though, does involve not adding conjectural building elements. So, if you're doing something, it's going to be period appropriate, and it's not going to be something that's completely conjectural. Next standard is to look at changes that have acquired significance, so changes that are significant, are in a high enough style that they acquire a significance all their own. So in this case, we have a storefront that was added to a much earlier building. This is a 1920 storefront, clearly a lot later. They're using marble, they're using high quality glass. In this case, we would say this is an alteration that meets this, that would be significant. And if you were coming in for a tax credit on this building, we would say keep that historic storefront. It's a really well done storefront, and it has achieved a significance all on its own. Next is preserving distinctive features. So this is looking at any elements of the building or design features that are really defining to the structure. I admit this isn't always the best one because this one sometimes make me even cringe and laugh a little bit. This was a theater in Oberlin, and it had these wall hangings, and they actually had to recreate the wall hangings. That's not always the case for these, but they had all the materials there, and that was really made basically just putting on new fabric. But the character defining features, that was one of the big things to make this look like a Art Deco theater. Or another example, this might be the marquee of that theater. That you had the marquee, was in good enough repairable shape that you would keep that historic Art Deco marquee. As I mentioned earlier, we are looking at repair rather than replacement of historic materials. Using all means possible to actually retain that historic fabric. Because when you stop and you think about it, if you have a frame building, roof's going to get replaced at some point in time. You're going to replace you know, if you replace all of the walls, all of the wood siding, all of the trim, all of the windows, and then on the interior, you'll probably might update something. You've replaced all of the plaster, and while you're at it, you're going to rip out all the flooring and put in just LVT because it's easier. Then suddenly you have a historic frame. You have a house that looks old, but if you've replaced all of those materials, then there's nothing really all that historic about it except for that frame. And therefore, the goal of the program is to help retain as much of that historic fabric as you possibly can. Because again, we know some stuff's going to change, some stuff's going to come off, and it's trying to avoid that cumulative loss of all that historic fabric. Do no damage to your historic building. This is usually summarized as "thou shalt not sandblast." I know we sometimes look at the language for the masonry and it's the nozzle and the 300 psi and everything like that. A large part of that depends on the type of the brick. And what we're trying to avoid is if you sandblast brick, and particularly if it's an older brick, this is what you might end up with. You end up blasting off the hard exterior coat of the brick, which exposes the soft interior of the brick, and also will probably lead to a much more porous and permeable exterior surface for that building. In this case, they added insult to injury by actually then going in with Portland cement, which is far too hard for this type of brick, and then actually will be can potentially destroy the brick through freeze-thaw cycle. But this is why we sometimes ask for those details, because we don't want you to do something that's going to A, cause you a lot more work, or B, cause the building to be damaged by that sandblasting or walnut shells or whatever else have you with blasting the brick. We're recommending that you find the gentlest means possible to make that work, to get rid of the dirt, whatever it might be. This one's a little less common, and it's to protect archaeological resources. But we all know that these areas have been settled for quite a long while. You may come across these things, but it's making sure that when you're doing construction, that you're respecting that there may be archaeological sites. Making sure that, yes. Uh-huh. So sandblasting it, you're ripping off the face of the brick. How is that saving the brick if you're ripping off the entire face of it? I can think of lots of other ways to clean brick. Sorry? But if we have brick here, I've seen 17th century brick that hasn't had to be sandblasted. That's the softest brick you're gonna find. If you had sandblasted it, it wouldn't exist. The interior of the brick, that's how a brick was made, particularly. But why would you sandblast it and then coat it when you could use a gentler means that doesn't then require you to coat it? But that's why you hire contractors. I mean, but you're getting a tax credit for it. But that's the point, that we're looking at this from a tax credit perspective. This is you saying, hey, federal government, hey, state government, give me some money to help me do this building. You're asking our opinion. We're telling you what you have to do in the tax credit perspective. You're saying, I want my, and that was the purpose of the program actually originally. Help give us money so we can do it better. And that's what we're saying is better. if you can do this, it costs you a little bit more to do that cleaning, then do that. Rather than sandblast it, go back and coat it, which can then end up causing. Because eventually that coating will fail, or eventually that coating will allow moisture to still permeate the brick because it doesn't stop all of the moisture vapor. And so then you have water buildup behind it that causes falling. And so then you've essentially ruined that brick. It's true. I mean, yes.
Different elements.
Generally speaking, I mean, between us and the Park Service, that's what we're trained to do. I mean, we know how bricks are made. We know how bricks are developed. I mean, there are cases, I've never seen a case where sandblasting was the answer. I understand it's,
I wanna know.
I mean, how were you saying policing?
Who is overseeing? Because I'm a cop, right?
Yep.
Okay. So you can be on level. Straight up.
Hmm?
What is the element?
Yeah. Yeah.
So who is? This- right. And where you can't carry it, you have to place it.
Mhm.
Oh. Now, or-
Yeah.
and that's this doesn't pass, then what happens? Right now,
So what we would be looking at is, when you're applying, you should have some idea. We were expecting that you're going to say, we're anticipating X%. And so you get a parapet wall, yeah, that's probably gonna need some new brick. When we're gonna want that brick to roughly match as close as possible. We're gonna want that mortar to match as close. We are reviewing that, because if we get that and it looks entirely different, then that's not meeting the standard. You know, we're not coming out here and, you know, using binoculars and looking at every building. We can't. Like right now, we have to over 100 applications. But one, again, we're giving, you know, we're doing the review. It could potentially, if it's a damaged situation, yes, it should be potentially a stop work. And I've had plenty of cases, I've had cases where they've failed and they've been denied. They said, no, you didn't do what you said you were gonna do at part 2. You didn't tell us,
that's. what
then
I'm
it's no
thinking.
tax credit.
Right. I mean, for building, there's very key in mind for- and,
Yeah, so you have to do,
I want.
unless it's a
Or-
huge thing.
Maybe.
I think it's more than 30 days. You and I. There are a lot of good old. Look better. Or better. than- or- That's- oh. Put through. Oh, or- but- My experience. Oh. Fire back. Don't. Back.
Well, can I ask, when was, so you mentioned the hotel, is that, how many projects have you done? I'm just, and how, and just how recently, because one of the things is, and that's the thing. A lot has changed of this tax credit.
I would. There's stuff better.
And
Not very.
so if you have, or I mean, I'll be getting, but let's just go ahead and hit this one. Historic windows, yes, they're a problem. If you have historic windows that are in good shape, they're going to say keep it. You can do storm window, you can. Now, in your type of window, if it's a, depending upon size, I don't know what the building is, so I don't know size. But in most cases, they'd say, look, if you do not have or extant, or they are placement, or they're poor condition, probably what you will end up going with. That's as aluminum clad. The reason usually use that is there's less shadow lines, less issues with that. Yes, because quite frankly, no one today would ever tell you to put wood. Because today's woods, right? That's the thing. Today's wood, if you go chop down a tree now and you try to make a wood window, it's going to be gone in 5 years, if that, because it's not good. So that's one thing to think about with windows. If it's, yeah, that things have changed a lot in this time frame. I'm sure there's still things that you would run into and you're just like, "Gee, this is stupid. I don't get it." Part of it is pulled out of our hand, is how the Park Service does it. But again, this is a voluntary program. So you ask us, that's what it's gonna be.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
So, it's not.
Yeah. Again, it depends on the current condition of the window. Crack in the glass, or you're gonna be replacing the glass. And arguably, from my perspective, sometimes it's glass a lot easier than a whole window, and if the whole window fails. But I'm not. But it depends on the circumstance. What do you mean? Mhm. You could do storm windows, yeah. No. You would do a storm window. Generally speaking, we would say it's best depending upon the. So if it's like a double hung window like these, you'd have a division bar, and that generally the frame would be thinner. That's what we do. Storm. Yep. Hmm. Because once you pay them, you're never getting that pain back out.
Well, I. really. I think. Weird. Weird. But, there- but there- or- Thermal. Oh. You know. Right. Was- We appreciate. Right across the pond. There's some.
About, and doing the app. That they don't bring it back. So open. as- After. That.
Not
you'll
about
see the
fountain.
half-board window and then storm window and it's really. on the Back, totally on private money, and it looks. Is a character downtown. And and now they're having this. Flourish all over new business. Back that small town of like, I would have done. Are. I think energizing. Having tax credits.
Yeah, they haven't used tax credits and they don't have local designation either.
Right,
my
right,
knowledge.
just started. Ask
The last time I was there, they still didn't have the clock tower. It went down in the Derecho, so it's been a while since I've been in the Bell Fountain. So jumping back in, next standard is contemporary but compatible. That if you have additions or alterations to the building, they're going to be differentiated from the historic building because you don't want something again that's a fake addition to the building that's not compatible. But you also want something that's going to be contemporary. So we're not saying no to any kind of new development, but it gives you alterations and options. Oop. And then also making sure that alterations are going to be reversible. So in this case, this was a vestibule that was added into the library in Columbus, and it's on rubber gaskets, so they're able to remove it. This is just to go a little bit over some of the documentation stuff. One of these is MEP stuff. Sam showed you what some of that information was needed. What we're looking for is to have enough information that the drawings and the narrative match and that it shows that the work is feasible. Basically, part of the problem is we've had instances where people will actually have plumbing drops in horrible places on like their first floors, piercing through pressed metal ceilings. I've had a toilet sanitary line right by a storefront. It's probably not a great place, and they had left it open. So, you know, literally you knew it was the sanitary line right there. We're looking to make sure it's going to be feasible and that things are going to be covered and that it's actually you're going to be able to do what you want to do with the MEP stuff. Making sure that you're taking care of historic finishes and features. So if you have elements that are underneath, that you're respecting those historic character defining elements. And that you're uncovering them when you find them if they've been covered up. That you're also looking at historic layouts. So in this one case, we have historic layout. Clearly, it's the original bank, still in the same location, still has the same exact layout. In this other building, nothing was left. They had some exterior stuff. The entire interior, entire layout, everything was gone. But they did find a marble corridor. And so they actually had to keep that marble corridor because that was the only thing left, basically, of historic character defining feature in this historic building. When we're looking at storefronts, we're looking again at compatible storefronts. On the left one, let's see. I know people who have architecture degrees are in here. What's the problem with the left storefront? It's a subtle thing. Curves are original. I actually had a frame. Come on, Chris, you should do this. It's the left. No, there's an issue with the left. Kind of, I mean, love it. The thing that's the last panel. Never be appropriate in a storefront. You would always have a solid panel kick plate at the bottom of the storefront. Bulkhead. I just love that one because I saw that when I was doing the review on this, and I'm like, ooh. Other one is what we're looking more typically of a storefront. You know, it's showing the recesses. It's showing a much more typical kind of a storefront. Looking at rooftops. In this case, this was a step too far. This was just a warehouse building that they decided that they wanted to try and replicate the Goodyear and Firestone style signs on the top of their building, for their storage building. This was a step too far though, and they were not allowed to do this. But if you, yes. Not necessarily saying that. This was a gigantic illuminated sign. Like like over a story illuminated sign on top of their building that never would have had something. So signage, one of the things we do look at is what's in the district and what is historic, what's existing in the district, what historically existed. So we will be looking at details like that. I mean, you've got a commercial district, there's going to be some signage downtown. So you may not be able to get, you know, a gigantic marquee that's all LED lights, but signage may be possible. If you're doing a rooftop addition or rooftop changes, this is the kind of thing that we would be looking for. Keeping it away from the roof and trying to avoid showing too much, trying to lessen the amount of what is visible. This is an example of when a new addition goes a little bit too far. A new addition should be subordinate to the historic building and not overwhelm it. Clearly in this addition, you can see in the second, I guess that's the right photo, the large addition, that was way too much. Basically, it was over triple the size of the building. So it was also like a 4-story addition. You're hitting the wrong one. And then this is it from the side. You can see why it's a small, regular size, Tudor style house that they were proposing behind it. Sure, you can do that. I think they actually may be doing that, but they're not getting the tax. It's too overwhelming for the overall problem. Windows, won't belabor this one too awfully much, because we've had a lot of discussion, but this is a good example though of one reason we do say stuff, because we've seen these kinds of issues a lot. Someone comes in, they want to do just that regular vinyl window on the side, it doesn't fit, they have to add a thing at the top. You know, we laugh, but at the same time, how many times have we seen that's the window that's proposed? And it's not really an appropriate window because it doesn't even, you know, how much daylight does that cut out? Did they remember to actually insulate above it? And it just doesn't look that good compared to the other one. Us looking at this again, I was on the ground, this is second floor, so I can't 100% say. I would argue they probably could have repaired the original window and put in a storm. And it potentially could have saved them money or cost about the same, depending upon the windows. And this is another example, is actually from the same building that had the gigantic addition. We are looking though at the details if you are proposing replacements. Not going to make this the sure, but if you notice, so this notice action and frame. This one, notice, added a whole extra element around that window. And in this building, trust me, it was a wood windows and a Tudor style. It stood out because they had the wood frame and they put the frame inside of that window. We would have recommended probably just doing a sash only replacement. They needed to look at something that's going to be more compatible with this historic window because they had a lot of them still extant and in good shape. Well, and some I mean, again, this is a case by case, depending upon the kind of windows. This is a harder building. This one was more just to show the shadow line. In some cases, having the storm will get you some of the same R factor. I mean, it depends on the individual circumstances of the building and the window. A little bit more on masonry again. What are you doing with it? What's the condition? And just giving us information about what you're going to be doing with it, and covering that. And then just a couple quick little part 2 tips. Again, making sure that you're describing all aspects of the work and that you're accurately representing what the current conditions are. If you know where there are areas where there's been water infiltration, for example, that you're telling us where that was so we know what to expect and that you have an idea of what the work you're going to do in those areas is. Tell us what you're actually wanting to do. You know, it's sometimes good to give it a shot, even if you think you might be shot down. You know, make the case, try and make the case for what you're proposing to do and see if it'll make it. Another little thing on photos, just making sure you do cover every single room in your building, and that they're actually clear, focused, and bright. You have no idea how many times I get a photo and it's basically just like, I can see a little bit, I can see the window, and then everything else is dark because they took it facing directly in the window on a sunny day. So, go on a cloudy day. It's Ohio, there are cloudy days. Drawings, again, making clear, accurate, and showing enough detail, and making sure you're having both the floor plans, MEP plans, and then you're going to have detailed drawings of your windows, both existing and proposed. And then work items. Again, what's your pair of significance? What's the significant character defining features? Break it down into pieces that are understandable to you. If you're writing a small book for your work item because you're going floor by floor and it seems like you're getting lost in it, you may want to break it down into smaller pieces. And as an aside, those of you that are left, you can come up with your own work item form. So on the federal application, the cover sheet of that federal application is the contract form. That's essentially a contract between you and the IRS. This is my qualified rehab expenditures. This is what I'm doing. This is what you sign. The owner signs it, puts their social security or tax identification number. That information can't touch that form. However, So long as you provide the information that is on the federal Part 2 form, the actual text, what the work items are, you can actually come up with your own Word document or whatever and do your own form. And I've had a few actual new applicants finally start doing that, and it's very liberating because that stupid federal form still laugh. Now, if it goes digital, it might change, but that PDF is just very persnickety. So keep that in mind next time. Okay. Sorry, we went a little long. Questions? No rotten vegetables. You can throw a cookie. I'll eat the cookie though. Sure.
Already left, I'll tell everybody that have a bio. And there's a lot of the help of Bevel. That I have cell numbers. You know, he just said it's very doable. It's all excited. You got $50,000 for the visit. Really cool to hear from a normal person. You know, just how offer anybody her buddy and he actually put going.
So you got check for $50,000.
Remember Sam? But he's he's a retired teacher that.
Was that from the state application?
Yeah, I
know
think
that-
No, that would have been 25% of the QRE. So they'll take out whatever the liability. So if I owe $500 in tax, I owe more than that. But they would take out the $500 probably to pay your tax that year, and then which then the federal government then taxes. But sorry.
Oh,
It's very.
If you're doing millions and millions though of the return on the state level, that's when they start raising 1,000. But all right.
I mean, looking at.
When was the remodeling?
Oh, it's done before you bought it. As long as it's bad work. Bought it. So as long as it's still. Depending upon the condition and how it's done.
It's so weird. Yeah.
I was looking at the map when Stan was talking about it, like.
That's been.
Oh. Hey, right, but- Yes. So,
Are you asking eligible?
yeah,
Or-
but, what fresh?
So, I mean, a nonprofit can take advantage of it. That just definitely. I hate that we had that. Action. I mean, I had a building, they haven't done it. Basically. It could be. Really funny. And, and so, that's what we start taking place, replace other groups now,
Yeah, there's,
final, just, and.
no, it wouldn't.
So. And that's what, that's where have. Yeah. And, um. If it's not abandoned, like, not gonna. Damn. We're gonna be punched at some point, but. As long as it.
It's still functional. That's the last.
Well, get it if you want. Look. Yep. Yeah. Well, and. The building contractor, typically is a little. So, some of, some. Or- Oh. Darn it. You know, that's a problem that. And then. Long. Hour. That's right, that's what. And the next day. Then. Sign up, site visit, and. This. I. Have. And. Problem. Prioritize them. That's our all. Heather, Heather typically is going to. That, if you have, however, a issue, you can also. Go first. Like, there's one version of like. They buried it. Like, right now. But it was essentially take photos, send it into the. Tell us the problem. I back on it. One they lost two. They just held it photo. See where it goes. that case, it was, yeah. Yeah, those are now, building doctors, right now. Are by because and just email me and tell me about the right thing.
Cover that nobody in my house. This. Minutes. Went a little over. Pardon?